So a new king is on the throne, but there are two more upsets and upheavals to come. This last section is called Plague and Fire. Now that Charles II was on the throne, the theatres reopened. England's noblemen crowded to concerts, plays and balls. The experiment of the Commonwealth had failed, but most Englishmen and women felt relief. The constant battles and upsets of Cromwell's years were finally over. The years of Charles II's reign are now called the Restoration, because England's traditional monarchy was restored to the throne, and England's traditional way of life was restored as well. But although the first years of the Restoration were joyful, catastrophe was just around the corner. London, England's largest city, had grown and grown and grown. At the time of the Restoration, London had nearly 500,000 people living in it. It was filled with rows and rows of wooden buildings shoved close together. The houses even jutted out over the narrow streets so that you could reach out your hand from a window and almost touch the house across the way. London was both crowded and dirty. Drains and gutters were ancient, often blocked with cracked stones and trash. Filthy water and sewage spread across the streets. 2 or 3 poor families crowded into single rooms. Just 4 years after Charles II's triumphant return, ominous rumours began to spread. A few men had died of plague on the far edges of London. The plague, also called the Black Death, was no stranger to Londoners. Londoners had died from plague before, and in great numbers. London's packed, filthy streets were the perfect place for disease to spread. So Londoners waited, holding their breath, for news of more illness. They hoped desperately that the plague would simply die away. It appeared to only be in the outskirts of the town, wrote the Lord Chancellor of London, and in the most obscure alleys among the poorest people. But soon horrible news filtered through London's taverns. Whole families were dying, and the sickness was spreading across the city. By Christmas, thousands of Londoners were dying every week. The plague raged on and on for months. By June of the following year, the sickness had spread into the city centre. Londoners tried to flee into the country, but villagers drove them away, terrified they might bring plague with them. In London, few dared to venture from their houses. Shops are shut in, wrote one Londoner. Very few people walk about, insomuch that the grass begins to spring in some places, and a deep silence is almost every place, especially within the walls. So many people died that London began to run out of room to bury the dead. The churchyards are now so stuffed with dead bodies, another London observer had wrote, that in many places they are 2 or 3 feet higher than they were before. Men were hired to pull huge wagons called plague carts through the street, shouting, "Bring out your dead," so that the bodies could be collected and dumped into huge pits. The English writer Daniel Defoe was only a child during the plague, but he used the stories of others to write an account of the plague. He wrote, "London might well be said to be all in tears. The plague defied all medicines. The very physicians were seized with it, with their medicines in their mouths. There was scarce any passing by in the streets, but the several dead bodies would be lying here and there upon the ground. Death reigned in every corner." The people of the 17th century didn't know that the plague was spread by the fleas who lived on rats. Indeed, they thought that animals made the plague worse, but the wrong animals. The Mayor of London ordered all dogs and cats killed. This meant there were more rats, more fleas, and more plague. Samuel Pepys, an English aristocrat who kept a diary of those years, wrote, "Little noise was heard day or night, but the tolling of funeral bells." Finally, the plague began to die away. It had raged for a year. Over 200,000 people had died, 2 out of every 5 people in London. But as Christmas drew near, shops began to reopen. People once again walked in London's streets. Slowly, London was returning to normal. But less than 9 months later, another tragedy struck. Late one September evening, in the year 1666, the King's baker was stoking his fire for the night in his bakery in Pudding Lane. A coal fell out unnoticed and began to burn its way into a stack of brushwood nearby. The floor caught fire, and then the walls. The bakery dissolved into flames. The fire spread to the baker's house nearby. Soon, the Lord Mayor of London himself was woken by his servants, and told that a fire was burning in London. True, only 2 houses were alight, but because London's wooden houses were so dry and close together, small fires could spread quickly. The Lord Mayor had been sound asleep, and he was cranky. He got grumpily into his coach and rattled down to Pudding Lane. He got out, walked down to the fire and gazed at it. "Pish," he said. "A woman could put that out." And he got back into his coach and ordered it back home. But barely had the Lord Mayor disappeared down Pudding Lane than the fire spread to the house next door, and then to the house next to that. The summer had been dry, and the wind was blowing the flames along Pudding Lane. Some of the people in nearby houses collected their precious belongings and carried them to the stone church nearby, where they might be safe from flames. Others formed lines down to the Thames River and passed water back up to the blaze in leather buckets, chamber pots, soup bowls, and every other container they could find. But the fire was spreading too quickly. Just down from the bakery, a shipbuilder's house stood, its cellar crowned with barrels of tar used to seal the seams of ships. When the cellar burned, the barrels exploded. The roof of the house blew off. Fire spouted upwards. Bits of burning shingle and wood flew out for dozens of yards and caught other houses on fire. It was, in the words of Samuel Pepys, an infinite great fire, everything, after so long a drought, proving combustible, even the very stones of churches, the churches, houses, and all on fire, and flaming at once, and a horrid noise the flames made, and the cracking of houses at their ruin. The fire spread across the city, burned wharfs, stacks of timber, houses, and even Baynard's castle, a stone castle filled with wooden furnishings. Taverns, shops, churches were burned. Hundreds of people fled to the enormous stone church at London's centre, St. Paul's Cathedral, but the flames swept up the walls, burning timbers and melting the lead in the roof till it ran down towards the river like molten lava. The stones in the walls themselves began to explode from the heat. The fire burned for 3 days. Finally, the soldiers fighting it began to blow up houses in front of it with gunpowder, pulling away the wreckage so the fire would have no fuel. The wind began to die down. The fire hesitated, and it finally began to flicker out. But 4/5 of London had been burned. 13,000 houses, almost 100 churches, and almost all official buildings, courts, jails, post office, printing presses were gone. Londoner John Evelyn, weeping, wrote in his diary, "London was, but is no more."